They thought I was just the janitor, the one who cleaned their floors, emptied their trash, and quietly worked behind the scenes for over a decade. What they didn't know was that I was the silent owner of the company all along. For 15 years, I watched, listened, and waited. Then one day, I walked into the boardroom and changed everything. This is the jaw-dropping story of how a so-called nobody became the most powerful person in the company and fired the very CEO who once ignored him. For over a decade, every weekday at 5 a.m., Elise Monroe pushed open the heavy glass doors of Ardent and Vale, a towering steel and glass behemoth nestled in the heart of downtown Halden City. As the office lights flickered on, she'd begin her routine, vacuuming pristine carpets, scrubbing smudges from conference tables, and wiping away yesterday's fingerprints from the glass walls that gleamed like mirrors. To the employees who passed her in the halls, Elise was a ghost, someone who existed in the periphery of their world. They nodded at her occasionally. Some offered a polite smile, but most of them ignored her completely, and she didn't mind. Or at least, that's what she told herself. But things changed on a bitter Thursday morning. The new CEO, Damian Grisham, was hosting a boardroom meeting. Elise had entered to clean up the remains of a late dinner the executives had left behind. Cold coffee, half-eaten pastries, and crumpled napkins. She worked quietly, like she always did. But when Damian spotted her, he frowned in disgust. "Can't you do that later?" he snapped. "This is a place for business, not for cleaning people." The room went quiet. Some executives chuckled nervously. Elise lowered her eyes, nodded, and backed out. That moment, sharp and stinging like broken glass underfoot, planted a seed deep inside her. She had tolerated the looks, the whispers, and the disregard. But this public humiliation awakened something she had buried for years. It was time. 15 years before Elise Monroe ever set foot into Ardent and Vale as a cleaning lady, she stood at the bedside of a man who had meant everything to her. Malcolm Monroe, her uncle, her mentor, and in many ways the only father figure she had ever known, was in the final stages of his battle with cancer. Once tall and full of life, Malcolm now lay quiet, thin as paper, his breaths shallow and spaced. Elise had been with him every day in those final months, feeding him, reading to him, holding his hand when the pain got too sharp to bear alone. Malcolm had been a man of few words, but the ones he spoke always carried weight. He was one of the original minds behind Ardent and Vale, a visionary, but not the loud kind. He believed in quiet excellence, in treating people with dignity regardless of their title, and in creating something that outlived ego. While others chased power and prestige, Malcolm sought purpose. "You've got something they don't," he once told Elise, his voice hoarse but steady. "You listen, you notice things, you understand people. That's what this company desperately needs. Not more suits, not more boardroom bravado, heart." Elise remembered those words. They stayed with her long after he passed. When his will was read, no one was more surprised than she was. Malcolm had left her his shares in Ardent and Vale, a significant portion, enough to make her one of the largest private shareholders in the firm. The room had gone silent. The executives, lawyers, and family friends all exchanged puzzled looks. Why her? A woman with no corporate background, no management experience, no visible interest in business? But Elise understood. He hadn't chosen her for her resume. He had chosen her for her integrity. At the time, Elise was in her early 30s. She had just lost her mother after a long illness and was juggling part-time jobs just to keep her head above water. The inheritance to some might have been a golden ticket, but to Elise, it felt more like a responsibility she wasn't ready for. She didn't want to step into a world of boardrooms and quarterly earnings reports. She was grieving, exhausted. She needed time. So she tucked the share certificates into a safety deposit box at a small bank on the outskirts of town, and she walked away. But she didn't walk far. When she eventually found work again, she chose something simple, honest, familiar. A cleaning job at Ardent and Vale, the very company her uncle had helped build. Most would have seen it as ironic. Elise saw it as grounding. She wanted to understand the company from the ground up, to see what it had become without the lens of a title or the filter of status. So she listened. She watched. She walked the halls and learned the rhythm of the place, what made it tick, where it cracked, and who it forgot. Years passed. CEOs came and went. Some were driven, ethical, and empathetic. Others were greedy, blind to the human cost of profit. Elise never interfered. She let them run things as they pleased, while quietly attending shareholders' meetings under a different name, reading financial reports in the evenings, and tracking decisions that sent ripples through the company. She kept buying small shares whenever she could afford it, little by little over the years. No one suspected a thing. Why would they? She wore gloves and carried a mop, not a briefcase. But all the while, she was building something invisible. A presence, a power, a quiet authority that no one saw coming. By the time Damian Grisham walked into Arden & Vale with his sharp suits and sharper tongue, Elise wasn't just another shareholder. She was the majority shareholder. She had the power to reshape the company her uncle had once dreamed of, and the strength to stand up to the man who thought of her as nothing more than the help. And after that humiliating encounter in the boardroom, Elise realized something else. It wasn't enough to hold power silently anymore. It was time to use it. Elise Monroe had never been one to act out of impulse. She understood the weight of her power and the danger of rushing into a war without knowing every weapon at her disposal. Removing Damian Grisham from the top of Arden & Vale wouldn't just require a majority vote. It would require evidence, the kind that left no room for excuses, no chance for denial. Cold, hard facts that would expose not just his arrogance, but the rot he had quietly spread through the company. So Elise did what she had always done best. She observed, she listened, and she remembered. While others looked past her, assuming her presence was as unimportant as the dust she swept away, Elise was already several steps ahead. Her years as a cleaner had given her access few realized mattered. Conference rooms after meetings, executive offices late at night, conversations whispered in corridors when no one thought they were being heard. Elise was there for all of it. She began to see a pattern. Under Damian's leadership, the soul of Arden Vale was slowly being gutted. He started by shutting down departments he deemed non-essential, community outreach programs, employee wellness initiatives, the Diversity and Inclusion Office. These weren't cost-saving measures. They were ideological scalpel strokes, cutting away at the heart of the company her uncle once built. She noticed how certain names began disappearing from the company directory. Talented individuals who had devoted years to their departments were let go or pushed out without explanation. And it wasn't random. More often than not, they were women, people of color or older employees, those Damian didn't see as modern assets. It didn't stop there. Rumors floated through the air like dust motes, whispers of lavish bonuses for Damian's inner circle, even while staff-wide raises were frozen. A new penthouse office remodel, first-class retreats disguised as leadership conferences. Elise couldn't rely on whispers alone, though. She needed proof. So, after every shift, when the building lights dimmed and her body ached from hours of work, she'd return to her small apartment, pour herself a mug of herbal tea, and begin the real work. Her kitchen table became a command center. Folders, flash drives, and notes written in precise detail covered its surface. She documented everything: timelines of questionable decisions, copies of discarded memos, receipts left behind in trash bins, and inconsistencies in public reports compared to what she found behind the scenes. It was tedious work, and it took months. But she wasn't alone. One evening, Elise picked up the phone and called someone she hadn't spoken to in years, Mara Wexler, an old childhood friend who had gone on to become a corporate lawyer specializing in whistleblower cases. Mara had always been sharp, and Elise trusted her with the truth. When Elise explained the situation, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "You're telling me," Mara said slowly, "that you've been cleaning this man's office for years, and he has no idea you own more of the company than he ever will?" Elise gave a soft laugh. "He never bothered to ask who I was." They met the next day, and from there, the case took shape like a storm gathering strength. Together, they compiled everything: financial discrepancies, internal policy violations, reports of unethical firings, and backdoor transactions that, if exposed, would shake the company to its core. But for Elise, this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't just about ousting Damian. She could have pulled rank the day after that boardroom insult. She could have demanded his resignation with her majority shares alone. But that wouldn't have changed anything. If she walked in and simply fired him, The system that allowed someone like him to thrive would still remain. The silence, the fear, the unchecked power. She knew better than anyone that real change required more than a new face at the top. It required exposing the truth. It required tearing down the illusion that people like Damien were untouchable. And most of all, it required standing up. For every person in the company who had been silenced, dismissed, or made to feel small. Elise wasn't just cleaning up messes anymore. She was preparing for a reckoning. The grand auditorium of Arden and Vale had always felt like a place reserved for the powerful, sleek, cold, and polished to perfection. Elise Monroe had spent years cleaning its rows of leather chairs, wiping smudges from its chrome railings, and vacuuming the stage carpet after every shareholders' meeting. But today, she wasn't there to clean. She was there to confront. For the first time, she entered through the front doors as a guest, not in her navy blue work uniform, but in a sharply tailored suit that fit her like armor. Her hair was neatly pulled back. In her hand, a sleek black folder filled with evidence that could burn the whole illusion to the ground. The room was packed. Executives in expensive suits, shareholders with glossy portfolios, assistants whispering to their bosses, and Damien Grisham himself seated confidently at the center table, exuding arrogance in every gesture. Elise walked past them all, her steps measured and steady. No one recognized her, not at first. When the new business section of the meeting began, the moderator called her name. Elise Monroe. A few heads turned, puzzled. Then, Damien looked up, smirked, and leaned back in his chair with mock amusement. "The cleaning staff wants to speak?" He chuckled aloud, once right, making no effort to hide his sarcasm. Scattered laughter followed, the kind that lives on the edge of cruelty. But Elise didn't flinch. She walked to the podium, calm and poised, her eyes scanning the room. The same room that had once looked down on her. Now, every pair of eyes was on her, and not one of them knew what was about to happen. She opened the folder slowly, looked up, and spoke clearly. "My name is Elise Monroe," she began, her voice steady, full of quiet power. "And I hold 52.6% of this company's shares." It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Mouths fell open. Chairs creaked as executives leaned forward in disbelief. Whispers rippled across the auditorium like a wave crashing against the shore. Elise continued, unwavering. "I have been a silent partner in Arden and Vale for 15 years. I chose to stay in the background. I chose to learn about this company from the ground up, literally. And over time, I've watched what this place has become under Mr. Grisham's leadership. I've seen the programs he dismantled. I've seen the lives he's disrupted. I've read the financial reports he hoped no one would question. And I've gathered proof, documents, statements, discrepancies that point not only to poor leadership, but to deliberate abuse of power." Damien's face turned red. He stood, sputtering, but Elise raised a hand, silencing the room again. "I am here today," she said, louder now, "to do what should have been done long ago. As majority shareholder, I am exercising my right to make a motion." She turned, locking eyes with the board of directors, people who had once ignored her, who had laughed when she passed them in the hallway. "Effective immediately," she declared, "I am terminating Damien Grisham as Chief Executive Officer of Ardent and Vale." The room exploded, gasps, murmurs. Some sat in stunned silence. A few, those who had suffered under Damien's reign, clapped, slowly at first, then with growing confidence. Damien stepped forward again, trying to speak, but Elise was already handing her file to the legal team seated nearby. She didn't need to argue. The document spoke louder than any defense he could offer. The board called an emergency vote. It was swift. It was unanimous. Damien Grisham, the man who had once mocked her for cleaning up his trash, was stripped of his title before he could even sit down. Elise didn't smile. There was no gloating, no satisfaction in watching someone fall, just a deep, full breath, a release of the weight she'd carried for so many years. As Damien was escorted out of the auditorium, Elise turned back to the room and spoke one last time. This company was never meant to be a machine that chews up people and spits out profit. It was meant to be something better. And starting today, it will be. She stepped down from the podium, not as a janitor, not as a shareholder, but as the woman now holding the reins of the company her uncle had dreamed of, and that she was finally ready to lead. The days following Damien Grisham's removal felt like the first deep breath after a storm. the halls of Arden and Vale, once hushed with tension and fear, began to feel lighter, like a weight had been quietly lifted from every corner of the building. Elise Monroe didn't waste time. She wasn't interested in taking a victory lap or sitting behind a polished mahogany desk. That was never her goal. Instead, she walked back into the company, not as a ruler, but as a restorer. She began with the departments Damien had gutted without a second thought. The community outreach team returned to their offices to find fresh budgets approved and long-forgotten projects revived. The employee wellness program, once dismissed as unnecessary, was reinstated with better resources than ever before. The Diversity and Inclusion Initiative, reduced to a footnote under the previous leadership, was reborn, with a seat at the executive table and a voice that could not be ignored. But Elise didn't stop there. She launched a scholarship fund in her uncle Malcolm's name, aimed at supporting the education of employees' children and underprivileged youth in the city. She established mentorship programs to elevate voices that had long been unheard, especially women, older workers, and minorities who had once been quietly overlooked. And most notably, she demanded transparency. Every leadership decision now had to be documented and accessible to employees. Elise dismantled the corporate hierarchy that kept executives in ivory towers and insisted that communication flow in both directions. From the boardroom to the break room, everyone's voice mattered now. But perhaps the most powerful change Elise made wasn't written into policy. It was personal. She made it a point to walk the halls, not in designer heels or flanked by assistants, but in plain clothes, comfortable shoes, and a warm, approachable manner. She greeted everyone by name, from the interns to the security guards, from the marketing leads to the custodians she once worked alongside. When employees began to learn the truth of who she was, who she had always been, a wave of emotion rippled through the company. Some cried openly. Others were stunned into silence. Many admitted that they had passed her in the hallways for years without a second glance. They recalled the mornings they walked by her without saying a word, never realizing the woman behind the mop bucket carried the very soul of the company in her quiet strength. A few approached her in private, guilt heavy in their voices. "I'm so sorry," they'd say. "I didn't know." Elise never met them with bitterness. She only smiled softly and replied, "I wasn't invisible. You just weren't looking hard enough." That phrase echoed through the company in the weeks that followed. It became something of a mantra, a reminder to see everyone, not just the ones with titles or corner offices. It became a symbol of how quickly people forget that greatness doesn't always wear a name tag or sit at the head of the table. Through all the changes, Elise remained grounded. She kept her corner office, but never spent much time in it. She preferred walking the floor, listening, learning. When asked how she had the strength to endure so many years in silence, she said it simply, "Because some things are worth the wait, and some changes are only possible when you understand the people you serve." Elise didn't just lead the company, she redefined it. Arden and Vale became more than a name. It became a symbol of second chances, of quiet power rising, of dignity restored. And at the center of it all was a woman who had once cleaned the floors and now stood tall, not above others, but among them. Years passed. The story of Elise Monroe spread far beyond the walls of Arden and Vale. In business circles, she became a legend. In working-class communities, she became a symbol. And for the people who had once felt invisible, those who pushed carts, answered phones, delivered packages, or made coffee before the boardroom meetings, she became hope. Eventually, her story caught the attention of a national news outlet. They requested an exclusive interview, curious about the quiet woman who had risen from janitor to CEO, who had turned a corporate empire on its head without shouting, fighting, or demanding recognition. Elise agreed, though she had never sought fame. On the day of the interview, she arrived early, just as she always had in life. Her hair was streaked with silver now, but her eyes were as steady and warm as ever. She wore no designer suit, just a simple blouse and slacks, elegant in their modesty. The interviewer leaned in, voice soft but curious. "What made you wait so long to act?" he asked. "You had the power for years. Why now?" Elise paused. She looked down at her hands for a moment, hands that had scrubbed tile floors and held mop handles, hands that had sorted files and signed boardroom motions. Then she looked up, eyes steady. "There are thousands of people in every company," she said slowly. "Cleaners, assistants, drivers, cafeteria workers, people whose names are forgotten even though they show up every day. And they see everything. They hear the truth when others are too busy talking over it. But no one ever listens to them. Not really." She let that truth settle before continuing. "I waited because I wanted to understand, to see what this company had become and who it was becoming it for. I waited because I believed that when the time came, the truth would speak louder than any title. And it did." The interviewer leaned back, visibly moved. Elise turned her gaze to the camera. Her voice softened, but her words carried the weight of everything she had lived. "Never underestimate the person holding the mop," she said. "They just might own the building." The room was silent. Not out of shock, but out of reverence. And that, more than anything, was the legacy she left behind. Not just a company rebuilt, but a world reminded that quiet voices matter and dignity should never depend on a job title. Elise Monroe's story is not just about business. It's about belonging. It's about courage in silence and the power of patience, humility, and truth. And if her story moved you, if it reminded you to look closer, to listen harder, or to believe in your own quiet strength, then help us share it with more people. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of hidden heroes, quiet revolutions, and everyday people who changed everything. Because sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones we almost never hear.